I'm going to show you how to make one magical watercolor background and get 2 cards out of it. Alright, let's get inky. I will be using Lindys Magicals, but you can use watercolors or even ink blended background if that's what you're comfortable doing. I'm going to be using a piece of watercolor paper measuring 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I'm going to be taking a few containers and I'm going to add some water to them, and then I'm going to add a little bit of the powders to each container. I'm going to be making my own watercolors. In order to create a similar background, you're going to need 3 or 4 different colors. I'm going to spritz a little bit of water onto my watercolor paper. This is going to help the color move around. I'm going to add the darkest color to the bottom and 2 sides of the cardstock. I'm not really worried about it looking perfect. In fact, this is a really great technique for those of us that are not watercolorists. You're just going to plop some color down in the general area and it will turn out, I promise you. While the first color is still wet, I'm going to be adding my second color, and the second color is significantly lighter than the first one. Now I'm wanting a more dramatic look to my background, so I'm going to go in with that dark blue again, and I didn't add as much water to the Magicals. This is going to make that color more saturated. While these 2 colors are still wet, I'm going to tilt my paper side to side and back and forth. This is going to give a more natural blend within the colors. I'm going to take my wet paintbrush and add water right on the edge of the color. This is going to help guide the color to start blending it out into the next color. I'm blending out the colors in a U shape. This is going to make more sense when the background is finished and I cut it down to make the cards. Now it's time to add the lightest color, which I'm going for more of a galaxy look, so I'm going to be using yellow. Once I get the yellow down, I'm going to pick up the paper and move it back and forth and side to side so it kind of blends out a little bit. I went in with some more yellow only to realize that I wanted more white space in the center, so I used a paper towel to pick up some of that yellow. Depending on the look you want for your background will determine how many colors you use. I wanted to darken up the edges a little bit more and add some pink to the mix. And keep in mind that my paper is still wet. I haven't dried anything up to this point, but now my paper is really saturated with water and color. So what I'm going to do is, you can see I'm tilting it back and forth, and I'm going to dry that color in place as it's moving down onto the paper. I dried my background about 70% of the way. This is so I can splatter some white on it, and some of the splatters are going to soak into the paper and others will sit on top. This is going to add a lot of interest and depth to the background. I'm going to dry those splatters and then add some water to the background. I really want a combination of big drops and little ones, so I'm going to add the water in my hand and let some of the water drip off of my hand and take what's left on my fingertips and splatter it onto the background. This is really where the magic happens. The white starts blending into the color and the water dilutes some of the color, and this creates so much depth to the background. I'm going to dry it again. I know it seems like a lot of steps, but the end result is so worth it. Alright, now I'm going to be adding some more splatters, this time with the Magicals. This is going to add, yes, another layer of depth and lots of interest to the background. Now, I wasn't doing a very good job in keeping the darker splatters off of my yellow. It personally doesn't bug me that much, but if you don't want those dark splatters on your lighter areas on your background, be sure to cover it up with a paper towel or another piece of paper. Now I'm going to dry all of those splatters, and then here comes the fun part. We're going to add some gold shimmer. The gold I'm using is another magical. It's called Glitzy Magical Gleaming Gold, and it is highly pigmented shimmer. It's beautiful. I added it to some water and then I'm just splattering it all over the background. Here's a close-up look at the background. You can see all of the layers of color and the depth is just unreal. You can also see the shimmer from the Gleaming Gold Magicals. Now that our background is done, I'm going to show you how easy it is to get 2 cards out of this one background. Now I'm going to cut this panel in half, and to be completely honest, I don't know the measurements here. I actually just folded it in half and then cut where the crease was. And if you're new here, I rarely measure anything. I just eyeball it or use my fingernail to mark where I need to cut. Let me know in the comments if all your measurements have to be exact or if you just kind of wing it like I do. I'm going to be using this gorgeous stamp from All in Create, and I want to do some embossing. So I'm going to use this fancy anti-static tool that helps eliminate the excess powder getting where I don't want it to. Now I'm going to take that stamp and ink it up with some VersaMark ink. This is an ink that the powder can stick to. On one panel, I'm going to stamp pretty randomly, and then on the other panel, I'm going to stamp the image directly in the center. I do my tiny little happy finger dance on the stamp, and now it's time to add the embossing powder. I like to use super fine white embossing powder from Ranger. This is great for detailed images. Now I'm going to use my heat tool to melt that embossing powder. I love watching the embossing powder melt. Heat embossing is probably one of my favorite all-time techniques. I would love to know what your go-to or all-time favorite technique is, so leave it in the comments down below. Now, it wouldn't be a project for me without some white splatters. If you love splatters, leave a comment #splattertime in the comments below. I like to use Dina Wakley gloss spray. Because it's acrylic paint, it just kind of sits right on top. Now I'm going to dry that in place, and the next step is to add distress microglaze. If you do not use this stuff, you are definitely missing out. I call it magic in a bottle. The glaze not only seals everything, it gives the background so much life. I know it's hard to see on camera, but it helps brighten up all of those colors. I like to use a dauber tool to apply the glaze to the paper, but you can also use your finger, and a little bit goes a long way. After I'm done adding the microglaze to the paper, I'm going to add some black archival ink around the edges. This is going to help finish off the panels. I like to use a finger dauber to apply the ink. I find that this is the easiest way to do this. After my watercolor panels are all inked up on the edges, I'm going to add some double-sided adhesive to each panel. Off camera, I cut down some black cardstock and I tried to line up my watercolor panels best I could, but I don't measure, so I cut my black cardstock a little too small. As you can see, they are a bit wonky, but remember, these are handmade cards, so it just adds that special handmade touch. I cut down some black cardstock slightly smaller than my card base so I can have a nice border around it. Then off camera, I embossed some white cardstock with a 3D embossing folder from All to New. I added some foam tape to my watercolor panels and adhere them to my card base. Then I quickly realized I forgot something. So I needed to take off the watercolor panels off of the card base. So what I do is I use my heat tool to heat up the adhesive to make it easier to remove. Now I can add some gold splatters. I'm in love with the new-ish Foundry wax from Holtz. This stuff is so magical. In order to add splatters, you have to work really fast. So I add some to my paintbrush and just splatter away. I'm adding the gold to the watercolor panels as well as these hexagons that I cut out. Now I'm going to use my heat tool to set the wax. If you don't do this, it'll rub off and it'll just be a big mess. I added my watercolor panels back onto my card bases, and now I'm going to add some collage medium to these hexagons and adhere them to my card fronts. I'm going to overlap these for more interest, and I'm often really lazy when it comes to sentiments, so I really like to use the Holtz sentiment packs. These are full of great sentiment stickers. I added to a piece of black cardstock, and this is going to help bring everything together. I'm going to adhere the sentiment to the front of my card with some collage medium. Now, even though my cards are finished, the fun doesn't have to end just yet. These magicals are so versatile, your mind will be blown with how many techniques you can do with them, and you can learn all about them by downloading my free PDF guide. The link is in the description. You can also check out this short playlist right here.